Hello, and welcome to Fraud Talk, the ACFE's monthly podcast. I'm Jen Liebman, and today I'm joined by John Warren, the CEO of the ACFE, to talk about Fraud Magazine's most scandalous frauds of 2024. Each year since 2018, Fraud Magazine has published a roundup of some of the most audacious frauds we've seen in the news. Fraud Magazine staff compiles those fraud stories throughout the year, and then a group of us from the ACFE all meet to discuss which ones we think are particularly egregious. We put together a ballot for Advisory Council, a group of dedicated subject matter experts from all over the world who advise the ACFE on matters important to the anti-fraud field. The Advisory Council votes on those fraud cases that they think are most scandalous. So before we dig into the most scandalous frauds of 2024, I thought we could talk a little bit about what makes a fraud case scandalous and why we put this list together every year. So John, what makes a fraud most scandalous?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And by the way, thanks for having me. I'm very excited to be on. I always love talking about scandalous frauds. It's kind of my life. So in a sense, all frauds are scandalous, right? They all involve manipulation. Somebody gets victimized and no fraud is good. But I think when we talk about most scandalous for the year, what we're really looking at are a couple of factors. We want to know what, generated the most news coverage, what was in the press, what was of interest to people. We look at the amount stolen. Was it big? Obviously bigger frauds have more of an impact than smaller frauds. But, in some cases, a fraud could be really scandalous or really meaningful without having significant losses. So we also consider how many lives were affected. What was the impact it had on the community? At the end of the day, what our jobs really entail are protecting the community from financial crime and fraud. So whether it's amount stolen or lives affected, those are both factors that I think are really important. And then, relevance to the anti-fraud profession. How does this impact the work we do? How does it inform, the future of the way we consider fraud, or is it a new element? Is it a new type of scheme? Is it something that changes the way we think about fraud in general? So all those factors go into it. At the end of the day, it's probably more art than science, but it's a little bit, it when you see it, right? If you read it and you gasp, it's probably scandalous.
And now let's start talking about the most scandalous frauds of 2024. So for this first one, a U.S. federal judge overseeing this first fraud case called it the deadliest corporate crime in U.S. history. John, what happened with our number one most scandalous fraud of 2024? Boeing pleads guilty to defrauding the U.S.
Yeah, this is a really interesting case, and it's been in the news a lot. And one of the things that's interesting is we've all heard recently this year about the issue with the 2024 accident with the Boeing airline or the Alaska Airlines flight where a hatch blew off or a part of a hatch blew off a plane in flight. And that does play into this, but this case actually goes much further back than that. This started with two tragedies that happened in 2018 and 2019. There were two plane crashes separately. The first was in Indonesia in 2018, and it was really tragic. A Boeing 737 MAX jet went down, and 189 passengers and crew were killed. And then the next year in Ethiopia, a separate Boeing plane also went down, killing 157 passengers and crew on that flight. And so that sparked investigations into both crashes, which is typical. And investigators found that in both cases, the pilots lost control of their planes. I'm not a pilot, so I don't really know the right terminology, but it's something called the Maneuvering Characteristics Augmentation System, which was built into the Boeing MAX jets. And this was a feature that was designed to sense if there was something called an aerodynamic stall as the plane was flying. And if that was sensed, then for whatever reason, the MCAS system was supposed to push the plane's nose down. And I guess that's some way to, stabilize the flight when a plane is in distress. But what happened in these cases is in 2018 and 2019, both, that system triggered erroneously. There was a bad, it recognized something that wasn't there. It pushed the planes into a dive. and the pilots were unable to pull out of that dive, and that's what led to the crashes. So this all happens in 2018, 2019, before the pandemic. There's a big investigation. All Boeing flights, or all Boeing 737 MAX jets, are grounded around the world. It has enormous financial consequences to Boeing. They lose about $20 billion due to this, but that obviously that pales in comparison to the human loss. But what came of that 2021 investigation was Boeing pled guilty to fraud, to criminal fraud conspiracy, and they entered into what's called a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. government, the Department of Justice. And essentially what a deferred prosecution agreement is, more or less like corporate probation. And they paid a fine. It was like a $2.5 billion fine. It was massive. But then they also promised to tighten up and strengthen their compliance programs. And the way the agreement was set up was they would be on 3 years of probation. They kept their noses clean, and if they upgraded their security and compliance systems, then the conviction would be wiped off the books in 2024. So that's where we were for essentially 3 years. And Boeing was living under the terms of this deferred prosecution agreement. And then what happened in 2024, again, we all heard the story about the Alaska Airlines flight. And that occurred at a time where they were just about to come out from under this deferred prosecution agreement, but it sparked another round of investigation. And the question was, had they really improved their security and compliance programs the way they had promised to in the original agreement? And originally what had happened is there had been some information buried about the MCAS, or not reported, or inaccurately reported, or whatever, that should have gone to the FAA but didn't. And so when the U.S. government started investigating this in 2024, what they concluded was Boeing had violated that 2021 agreement. They hadn't lived up to the promises in the deferred prosecution agreement. So then what happens is that triggers a whole new plea deal, right? And now we have to start from scratch. So in July of this year, Boeing's lawyers and the DOJ lawyers sit down and they hash out an agreement. They say, okay, we're going to pay a fine of $243.6 million. And then in addition to that, we will spend $450 million to boost our safety and compliance programs, kind of the way we should have done in the first place. Along with that, we're going to agree, court, you can appoint an independent monitor to come in and oversee that we are upgrading our safety and compliance the way we've promised to. So this is the agreement. They announced this. The prosecutors and Boeing announces we've reached this agreement. Families of the crash victims become very upset. They say this is not strong enough. They urge the judge to reject it. The case is being heard in a federal court in Fort Worth, Texas. And for those who don't know, when you reach in a criminal case, if you reach a plea agreement, that's not the end of the matter. The prosecutor and the defense can't just reach the agreement. They still have to take it to the court, and a judge has to approve it. And in many cases, they won't. They'll say, well, this isn't a serious enough penalty given the nature of the crime, or this, I don't like the terms, or whatever. In this case, just recently in December, a federal judge in Fort Worth who's hearing the case, he did reject the plea agreement. It was a weird rejection because it doesn't, and I haven't read, full disclaimer, I haven't read the entire opinion of the court, but it doesn't appear that the deal was rejected on the basis of the monitorship or the fine. It appears that it was rejected on other requirements based around like DEI requirements and picking the independent monitor or so forth. So it feels like I'm not sure what kinds of changes are going to come about when they go back to the table, but go back to the table they must. The deal has been thrown out, and now the parties have to get together and work out a new arrangement. And if they can't, then the matter will go to trial. So that's where we stand right now. We still don't know the ultimate resolution of the case. But I think when we talk about scandal and what makes a case scandalous or a fraud scandalous, in this case, this really touches on that lives affected part of the criteria. And it's a good reminder that compliance issues matter not just for financial compliance, but if you're in certain industries, if you're in pharma, if you're in transportation, if you're in manufacturing, lapses in basic compliance can have really deadly consequences. I mean, this obviously had a huge financial consequence to Boeing, but beyond that, the loss of lives, the tragedy, the families affected, it's a really, really terrible case and a really good lesson for everybody. We have a lot of members who don't work in investigation, but really work on the compliance side. And it's a really good reminder of how important the work they do is.
All right, well, let's turn to our second most scandalous fraud. Now, usually death sentences aren't imposed on white collar criminals, but in Vietnam, that's what happened to real estate tycoon Trong My Lan, who was accused of committing what's being considered the largest fraud in Vietnamese history. What did Lan do that led to the court in Vietnam to sentence her to death?
Yeah, this is really unusual. And I remember when this case came out and everybody kind of raised their eyebrows, not like, whoa. The case itself is a fairly standard case of embezzlement and corruption in terms of the techniques used. It stood out for a couple reasons. One is the sentence, right? You don't really hear about somebody being sentenced to death for financial crimes very often. But the other is just the scope of it. It was a massive, massive fraud involving a major bank in Vietnam. Trang My Lan was the chair of the largest real estate company in Vietnam. It's a group called Van Tien Phat. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And she was found guilty in April of this year of embezzling about $12.5 billion from a bank known as SCB. Embezzled $12.5 billion, but there was actually a total of $27 billion in total misappropriated through a collection of schemes that happened at this bank. To put in perspective how big that, I mean, when we talk about billions of dollars, sometimes it's hard to remember the scope of that, right? Millions and billions and trillions and everything. $27 billion is about 6% of Vietnam's total GDP. This was a absolutely massive case in this country that had really serious repercussions for the economy. And I think that was, as we'll talk about, that was one of the reasons why when she was convicted, the court sentenced her to death by lethal injection, which is again, really noteworthy. The interesting thing about her is she's, in some ways, on paper at least, looks like kind of an inspirational figure. She starts in the early 80s in communist Vietnam as a market stall vendor. She sells cosmetics. She kind of really builds herself up from the ground up. And the history is what happened in 1986, the Communist Party introduced economic reforms in the country. And among those was it loosened up the ability for people to own property. And so she began buying up property and developed a really significant portfolio of hotels and office buildings and residential buildings over about a 15-year period. And she formed this company, Van Tien Phat, and was the chair. And by the time we get to around 2010, 2011, so about 15 years later, she is a real power broker within Vietnam, like one of the wealthier people in the country. And she helps then orchestrate a merger between SCB, the bank we talked about earlier, and a couple of other lenders. And the allegation is that although she was nominally the chair of this, the real estate firm, that she secretly controlled SCB and she misused that authority to embezzle, again, billions of dollars. There were just some of the details about the fraud are pretty staggering. The reports of like 1,300 falsified loan applications and $44 billion in fraudulent loans going out, 27 billion in losses. So presumably some of those got repaid, but still 27 billion lost to investors. discussion of siphoning off money through shell companies, billions of dollars going out to shell companies. There is bribery of officials to help pave the way for this. It was a really, really messy and large case. There was a government crackdown on corruption in 2022, and that's when through that investigation, she was arrested along with 85 other accomplices. All of them were convicted. It was an unbelievably widespread fraud. Her niece was the CEO of the real estate company at the time. She was sentenced to jail for 17 years. Her husband goes away for 9 years. There were 4 or 5 other people who went away for life. But she gets the harshest penalty. She's, as we said, she's sentenced to death by lethal injection. And, one of the things the court said at the time was this: she orchestrated this massive criminal enterprise. It has really serious consequences for investors and the public, and there was no possibility of the money being recovered, and that was a factor the court noted. And just to talk really briefly about the impact, when this happened, it sends shockwaves through Vietnam's real estate markets. There's fear of a run on banks, a panic, kind of similar to what we experienced in the U.S. in 2008 when some banks were having financial difficulties. The State Bank of Vietnam had to inject billions of dollars into SCB just to stabilize it, to prevent a wider panic and collapse. And so it was a giant case in Vietnam with real consequences. And kind of one of the loose themes of the cases this year is how the frauds that we looked at had impacts that went well beyond the companies that were victimized. This is a perfect example of that. So, yeah, convicted, got the death penalty, and she appealed in November. That appeal was lost in December, and what's kind of interesting now is now it's sort of a race to the executioner's dock. So apparently, and I'm far from an expert on the law in Vietnam, but apparently there's a law that says her death sentence can be commuted to life in prison, but to do so, she has to pay back 75% of what she took.
Yeah. So it's like $9 billion.
$9 billion. Yes, yeah. Exactly. She took $12 billion. She's got to get her hands on $9 billion. Yeah. So she's in jail. She and her lawyers are furiously working to sell off assets, according to what we know. As far as we know, and correct me if you know something different about this, Jen, I don't think there is any specified date for when this execution is supposed to take place.
I don't believe so either.
This becomes kind of this issue now, right? Like, how long is it going to take before she goes to the execution chamber, and does she have time to sell off her assets before that happens? It is, we kind of make a little bit light of it, but it's really very serious. And I would imagine future embezzlers in Vietnam will think twice about undertaking a scheme like this after they see what's happened to her.
Yeah, I don't think that this is something that will necessarily affect U.S. fraudsters, but
it's harsh. I mean, when we say we're going to get tough on fraud, I mean, Vietnam is getting really tough on fraud. And I mean, it was a really unusual case. Like, there aren't going to be a lot of cases with that kind of scope, but it does speak to how seriously that government took this crime. And I assume that's largely because of the impact it had. When you think about these financial crimes, you think about how much money the company lost or whatever, but they talk about here, there are people who invested in this organization or who were invested in these banks. And there's, people lose their life savings, people lose their, retirement, people lose, it has real human effect on individuals. And, indirectly, that can cause harm or even death to the people who were the indirect victims, if they don't have the money to pay for medicine or housing or whatever. So it really is a good reminder of how serious these cases are.
Okay, so Now, our third most scandalous fraud case of the year concerns a huge U.S. Department of Justice healthcare bust. It was largely directed at telemedicine companies that were prescribing attention deficit, hyperactivity disorder, ADHD drug, Adderall. So, what are some of the important details of this case?
Yeah, this was pretty sweeping. The arrest happened in June. 193 people throughout the U.S. were busted. The defendants collectively were accused of carrying out $2.275 billion in healthcare fraud schemes, and as you said, Jen, mostly involving Adderall or other stimulants like that. It's a really widespread problem, and when we talk about the impact that these frauds can have outside of the victim company, this is another good example because in 2022 or 23, I think the FDA had actually issued a notice about shortages in some of these prescription stimulants, Adderall and others. And that has real effect on people who actually need these drugs. There are thousands of people who take Adderall for ADHD or other ailments, and a shortage had occurred largely because these unscrupulous companies had worked up ways to gin up sales to people who maybe didn't need the pills. So the sort of poster child for these defendants was a company called Dunn Global, which was itself just as one of many defendants. This company, Dunn, was accused of illegally distributing roughly 40 million Adderall pills or other stimulants, and they generated about 100 million in revenue for themselves by doing that illegally. And their CEO and their president, along with 5 other employees, were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and submitting false claims for reimbursement. This was in June. The way they did it was pretty unsavory, but it's a good example of how a well-intentioned change in policy can have adverse consequences. So this all dates back to during the COVID pandemic when everything was on lockdown and people were social distancing. The government relaxed restrictions for online prescriptions, which, very well intentioned, right? There are a lot of people who need their medicine. Maybe they couldn't get to a doctor. Maybe they were, shut in or whatever. Maybe their doctor's office was closed. And so we say, okay, we're going to relax restrictions. I'm sure that helped many people. But what we in the fraud world know is anytime you make a change like that, the fraudsters or the unscrupulous folks are going to look for a way to exploit that for their own good. And that's what happened here. Dunn took advantage, along with many others, took advantage of those relaxed restrictions to promote and get thousands of people to get diagnoses and prescriptions for Adderall that they probably didn't need. And Dunn in particular, they spent there's information in the indictment that they spent millions of dollars on deceptive advertisements. They targeted people on social media. They emphasized it's super easy to get a diagnosis. It's super easy to get a prescription. None of this should have been true. They really set their whole model up kind of like a conveyor belt, right? It was just like, we want to churn as many of these prescriptions as we can through. So if you went to Dunn, you got a really short assessment. You got like a 30-minute assessment. Then they sent you to a telemedicine provider. They probably limited access to information for some of the prescribers. So to make it appear that you were qualified to get Adderall, the way they compensated their providers, it was based on the number of prescriptions issued, not necessarily on the number of patients seen. There was one case in particular. There was one nurse practitioner who was mentioned who prescribed 1.5 million pills to patients that she never even interacted with. So really, really egregious abuse of, what should be a medical professional's obligations. There was even a reference in the indictment to the fact that the CEO and the president, the CEO's name is Ruthia Ha, and the president's name is David Brody, that they were aware that people had overdosed and died through some of these prescriptions that they'd gotten illegally. They continued regardless. So they knew they were causing harm and basically disregarded that risk because they were getting really, really rich. They were arrested. They in June, and so the case is awaiting trial now. But another good example of, again, the impact that these frauds have outside the victim organization.
Yeah, I actually have a personal connection to this case. My partner has ADHD, and I remember when he couldn't get his Adderall, and it was definitely a very difficult time for him because it's like, ADHD affects people's like executive functioning.
Mm-hmm.
So for him, it's really hard to be an adult and go about your daily life when you need this particular medication to help you function as a grown-up.
Yeah. So, it's not just, obviously the people who overdose and die or whatever, that's terrible, obviously terrible, but it's also the people who can't get the medicine they really need because you're abusing the system over here. It's an awful case. Yeah. One other note about that, that is interesting. So the CEO, Ruthia Ha, I believe is how her last name is pronounced. So when she is arrested, circle back to 2023. She knows she's under investigation, and apparently the DOJ goes to her. She probably got a notice that she was a target of investigation, and she was required to turn over all her passports and travel documents. She's a Chinese national, and I think that's pretty sure that's pretty standard, that they don't want the subject of the investigation to flee the country and maybe get outside of jurisdiction. So she did. When she's arrested in 2024, she spends 3 months in jail, and then she's released to home confinement, which is basically what we think of, she's got the ankle bracelet. There's 24-hour surveillance of her. I think there might have been a guard. I'm not sure. And she is required to stay in her home. She's out. And then in October, she was sent back to jail because it turns out that she had obtained a travel document back in 2023 after she'd given her legitimate ones over to the DOJ, the Department of Justice, and had not told prosecutors about it or her lawyers. So it's not clear whether she was intending to flee the country, but she did have this illicit travel document. So now she's back in jail awaiting trial. And as of now, I don't know when the trial is set for. There's a hearing in January, but I don't think we've got a trial date set.
Okay. All right, thank you. So our fourth most scandalous fraud case, it seems like this case has been simmering for a number of years, getting ready to explode into a most scandalous case. John, can you talk about what went down with Chinese real estate development company Evergrande?
Yeah, you're right. This feels like it has been going around forever. People who aren't familiar, Evergrande at one point was the largest real estate developer in China and in the world as recently as 2018. And back in 2021, we started hearing news about the company was over leveraged, that there was a risk that they were going to default. They had something like $300 billion in corporate debt, and they may not be able to repay that. And if that happens, the companies like that, they essentially issue bonds, kind of like government bonds, and that's the way of financing projects. And so a bond is, more or less a loan. Somebody buys a bond with a promise of a 5% return on that investment or 3% or whatever. They've got $300 billion in these outstanding bonds. And they have to come forward and say, like, we're not going to be able to pay these. So this, all these investors now are on the hook and looking like they're going to lose their money. Right. So this becomes a big problem. But at least in 2021, as far as I think most of the public knew, it looked like a management problem or a financing problem. It didn't really look like a fraud problem. And, we saw this in the U.S. again in the 2008, 2009, when our own real estate market collapsed, and you saw a lot of lenders who maybe didn't have the best practices were kind of left holding the bag. And so it sort of looked like maybe it was going to be something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And flash forward to 2024, and in March, investigators who've been looking into this since 2021, they charge Evergrande with financial statement fraud. And the allegation is that they'd fabricated their sales, inflated revenues by about $78 billion in the financial years of 2019 and 2020. The method of doing it, it's, again, there's nothing novel about this. Financial statement fraud happens all the time. And what they did was they faked sales, right? And we see that a lot. What stands out here is just the scope. $78 billion. I think it was at the time, and probably still is, thought to be the largest ever financial fraud to occur in China, at least from what I've read about the case.
Yes.
Evergrande had a subsidiary named Hengda. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly.
I think you are.
Okay, good. I'm not. I apologize to any of our listeners who actually know how to pronounce these words. I'm trying my best. But Evergrande's founder was a man named Wei Qian, and he was the richest man in China. He controlled this company, and he directed people within Hengda to fabricate sales. In 2019, they fabricated $30 billion worth of sales, which is basically half of their revenue. The next year, it gets worse. They fabricate $48 billion. So that's how we get to $78 billion over the 2 years. That represents, by 2020, 87% of their profits are fake, right? And why that matters is because when you're making a bond issue, when you're going out and trying to sell bonds to finance projects, you're providing your financial statements to investors to say you can lend us money, you can buy these bonds, there's a good chance they'll be repaid because we're a solid financial company. In this case, that wasn't what happened, right? They were lying. Mm-hmm. They were propping themselves up with fake numbers. And anybody who's dealt with fraud for a while knows, as you start doing that, it becomes a vicious cycle where if you boost your profit by X this year, then the next year you have to boost it by a little more because you have to show year-over-year gains, and then a little more, and then a little more, and before long it spirals out of control, and it's a house of cards, and it all comes down. And that's kind of what happened with Evergrande. So in 2021, that collapse was rooted back in these financial frauds that happened in 2019 and 2020. So Wei Qian is charged. He's fined $6.6 million. He's barred for life from the security markets in China. He is, right now, it is thought that he's being held in Guangdong province. But as far as I could tell from my own research, nobody knows exactly for sure if he's been criminally charged. He paid civil fines. But yeah.
Yeah, that's the latest that I've heard. Could you talk a little bit about the auditing angle? They had PricewaterhouseCoopers auditing. So what was going on with that, and what's their connection to this case?
Yeah, that's the other side of this that makes it really noteworthy, is that any large financial company like that, any large publicly traded company like that is going to have outside auditors who review its financials. In this case, PwC in China was the auditor for Evergrande. And the allegations are that, and this is coming from Chinese regulators, is that PwC had inadequate internal controls. They basically missed the whole thing. I haven't seen evidence presented in court or anything, but the allegations are that senior PwC leaders within China acted unethically and helped cover up and condone the fraud that was going on within Evergrande. And there are examples, specific allegations include failure to maintain professional skepticism. In other words, they were taking Evergrande at its word with a lot of these transactions instead of verifying the sales were real, drawing false conclusions. There was one report that there were several Evergrande projects that had been reported as completed on their financials, even though in reality the land was vacant and nothing had been built. And regulators are pointing to this as stuff that PwC should have caught. Right now, what's happening in China, my understanding is there's a lot of hard look being taken at the audit practice and reevaluating the effectiveness of audit practices in China. Because what happens is if you don't have effective and reliable audits, then public confidence erodes in your financial markets. The reason we have audits is because investors need to feel secure that when they see a financial statement from an Evergrande or a WorldCom or an Enron, that they can confidently invest in that company because they know what its financial condition is. So when audits break down, that there's confidence in the system breaks down, and that affects the whole economy. So that's kind of the fallout on the audit side of this case. And I imagine we're going to be seeing a lot of reports and maybe revised regulations or revised oversight processes for audit firms in mainland China and Hong Kong coming in the next year as a result of this.
Thank you. So our last most scandalous fraud is actually a tie. So there were two major hacks this year, one with Change Healthcare and the breach of national public data. The Change Healthcare cyber attack wreaked havoc on the U.S. healthcare system, and national public data breach seems that it'll have some major implications for millions of people whose personal information has been compromised. So what happened in these two cyber attacks?
Yeah, this is these get lumped together, I think. And the sort of lesson from these, which we've already learned over the years, but it's such a good reminder, is that we're not just protecting money anymore. I've been with the ACFE for coming up on 30 years now. When I started, everything was about how do we lock down our money? How do we prevent fraud, financial crime, whatever? Threats to our data now are just as big a risk, and arguably a bigger risk in some cases, than threats to our finances. And these are great examples of that. So two cases, as you said, the Change Healthcare one is really interesting. What Change Healthcare is they're a company that acts as a clearinghouse for insurance fraud claims. They're owned by United Health, and they are, I believe, the largest clearinghouse in the country. I read somewhere that they process roughly a third of all the healthcare claims in the U.S. So when something happens to them and their data, that affects a lot of people, right? And so in this hack, it was actually two hacks that kind of went together. The first was by a group called Black Hat, and the second by a group called Ransom Hub. But the upshot is somewhere around 100 million people had their personal health information exposed as a result of these hacks. That's roughly 1 out of every 3 Americans had their personal health information exposed. So that's great.
Just great.
I read that it's the largest data breach in U.S. history. If it's not the largest, it's among the largest for sure. Part of what's interesting is it was such a simple, it wasn't like some sort of state actor level, infiltration by advanced hacking methods. What happened was hackers got an employee's login credentials. Pretty simple. It's such we hear this all the time, but with your data security, your weakest link is your people, right? You can have all the firewalls you want. You can have all the technical security measures you want, but if people don't keep their login credentials secure, something like this can happen. So the hackers got a hold of an employee's login credentials. That allowed them to access remote desktops. And critically, what happened here is Change Healthcare did not use multi-factor authentication. And if for those who don't know what that is, that's the really, really annoying thing where when you try to sign into your email, it says we're going to send you a text, and then you have to put back in the code, or you have to click a link or whatever. We all hate it. Everybody hates it. I hate it. Every time I get one of those sent to me, I'm like, why do I have to do this? This is why we have to do it, because they didn't have that implemented at Change Healthcare, and as a result, one out of every three Americans' personal health information is now out in the open. So anyway, 2 hackers, 1 black cat was the first. The second one was Ransom Hub. Ransom Hub took the money and said, we're going to sell this to the highest bidder unless you pay us. Yep. It was an extortion scheme. United Health had to pay $22 million to get their money back, or their data back. In the process, though, they reported losses of, I think, what was it, like to almost $3 billion, because while the data and the data is all tied up and operations stop, again, this is another example of how this has broader impact. This company processes massive amounts of healthcare transactions every year through the insurance system. This gummed up all those transactions. So it had an impact on our healthcare system in the country, right? People couldn't get their transactions processed. It blocked insurance claims. It delayed reimbursements. Hospitals weren't getting paid for work they were doing. They were missing payroll. There was one estimate that the Massachusetts healthcare system lost like $24 million a day. We saw hospitals get shut down. They went out of business. Patients had to be moved to other hospitals, all because of this hack. Really, really widespread impact. And then the second case was NPD, just more or less the same thing. This actually, I think more people's data was actually impacted. I think it was something like almost 3 billion unencrypted records were stolen that included people's social security numbers, names, information. This was through the US, Canada, and the UK. In this case, the bad guys posted that information on the dark web. So now there are criminals all over the world who can see our information, buy it, and start using that to commit identity theft. So, and in that case, in NPD, they actually went out of business, had to file bankruptcy, ran the company out of business. So, yeah, terrible, terrible, terrible cases. And, we just think about data as just data. But it isn't just data. It affects livelihoods. It affects people's health, people's pay, people's jobs, and so forth. So, yeah.
So we do have some cases that, they're notable and novel, but they may not meet all of our requirements. For example, the monetary loss might not be extremely large, but it's still kind of a crazy little case. We call them dishonorable mentions. So let's talk about the Los Angeles Dodgers superstar Shohei Ohtani's interpreter in that case.
Yeah, and you may have more detail on this than me, but I know it mostly through my life as a baseball fan. But Shohei Ohtani is like the best baseball player in the world. He's unbelievable, and his interpreter, I believe, was stealing money and from Ohtani because he had a gambling addiction. Is that right?
That is correct.
Yeah, and so it was really just interesting, just because of to me the famous nature of the victim, right? That this man who makes millions and millions of dollars and has agents and support staff and financial managers and stuff. At the end of the day, somebody close to him who was his interpreter, because he's a native Japanese speaker, he needed an interpreter. That person got close enough to him to take advantage of him in a personal way and stole quite a lot of money from him. Yeah.
Yeah, Ohtani is, I think he's the highest paid baseball player in the Major League Baseball. And I think he just signed a $700 million contract for 10 years.
Yeah, I think
So
that's right. Yeah.
he's a big one.
Yeah. Yeah. Big fish.
Yeah. So this other case that we have, there was this guy in North Carolina who created all of this fake music to um, to really scam like Spotify, Apple Music, these bands he created them all with artificial intelligence, and he used bots. Like bands with titles like Zygotic Washstands, Zymo Technical, um, just really weird, Callous Post, just all these really weird names.
Yeah.
And then used the bots to stream the songs millions of times. And he collected something like 10 million in royalty payments over 7 years with this scheme.
Yeah. This was, you don't want to say cool because you have to remember that these people are criminals and they're stealing, and that's not
Yeah,
okay.
it's
But
not
this was a
cool.
really novel use of technology. This one jumped off the page to me, right? That he it was AI driven, right? And he found a hole in the system of these music services like Spotify that apparently I'm not a musician. I've never put anything on Spotify, but apparently you get paid based on how many people stream your songs. So yeah, you use AI to write a song, then you use bots to stream that song over and over and over again, and the system then just generates royalties. He got more than $10 million over 7 years doing this before it was caught. It's odd. The names of the bands were amazing. Like Calvinistic Dust was my favorite. Like I would love to have a band T-shirt for Calvinistic Dust. But I think the actual important part of this is, right, that's an example of the kind of thing that's going to be able to happen with AI in the future in the fraud space that nobody would have even dreamed of this 5 years ago. And so it does make one wonder, like, what's coming next? Like, what other applications can AI be used for to take advantage of systems like this that just weren't set up to deal with bots and AI and artificial intelligence and all these new technologies? Is really interesting.
So I don't think we can get away with not talking about the Chase TikTok
Yeah.
viral
Yeah.
check fraud glitch.
Yeah.
This was, when I think about this one, I just think about how like an entire generation just got a lesson in check fraud.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Some TikTok users learned of learned that there was like a glitch in, they were exploiting the bank's ATMs. There's a banking rule that allows partial withdrawals from deposited checks before they're cleared, and then customers were able to deposit fake checks for large amounts, withdraw the funds before the checks bounced, and then they could keep the money. But this is actually fraud, and Chase sued all of these customers for this
Yeah.
so-called
Yeah.
glitch.
Yeah. This makes me weep for the future of our world, right? This was a case that made me learn I'm a bad parent because my kids showed me this and they thought it was cool at first, and I had to sit them down and say, "This is not cool. This is right. Like, I don't know what values I've instilled in you, but this is not cool. This is bad. This is very bad." But also, these kids, it's basically a check kiting scheme. All right, right. This has been around for hundreds of years. This technique. What was interesting about this was these kids were like doing it and filming themselves doing it and explaining how to do it. And I'm like, it was really a crazy scheme, but good on Chase for going after those people, because they need to understand I think there is something, and maybe this is just me as an old person, but I do think there is something with the current generation, that there's this dissonance between like what happens on the internet and reality. And you see somebody do it on TikTok and you think, oh, well, that's just the latest TikTok thing. But it's a reminder, they're stealing. This is a crime, and good for Chase for going after them and suing them and letting them see the consequences of those actions.
Yeah. And our last dishonorable mention is just a Ponzi scheme, really. It's Juicy Fields, this organization created, or this group of people created an investment platform where people could invest in medical marijuana. And what it just ended up being, your typical Ponzi scheme that ripped off 645 million euros from people. And Europol had a huge investigation where they arrested something like 9 suspects. Over 400 law enforcement officers in 11 countries were involved in this huge bust of a Ponzi scheme.
Yeah. Kind of your typical Ponzi scheme. I think what makes it interesting is just the nature of the investment and the medical marijuana. But yeah, it was, as with all Ponzi schemes, they're like destined to collapse. And I think, like you said, some people got their money back, but eventually you get too many people in it and the math starts working and investors are going to lose their money. That's what happened here. 645 million euro.
Yeah, I think they were originally told that they would get like 100% on their investments. And people started, as all Ponzi schemes, they initially make money. And then one day they go to access that money and they can't because it's all fallen apart.
Yeah. Yeah. And just lesson to investors again, everybody listening to this podcast already knows this. If somebody promises you 100% returns, turn around and walk away. That's not how things work. That's not how investments work, right? And that's a sign. If it's too good to be true, it's not true, right? And that's exactly what this was. And unfortunately, a lot of people learn that the hard way.
All right. Well, thank you so much for this excellent discussion on most scandalous frauds. And thank you for listening. You can find this podcast along with all other episodes of Fraud Talk on acfe.com, Spotify, iTunes, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. This is Jen Liebman signing off.
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everyone.